In this recent essay in Foreign Policy magazine, Michael Beckley, an associate professor of political science at Tufts University, and Hal Brands, the Henry A. Kissinger professor of global affairs at Johns Hopkins, asked the question, how likely is China to start a war? They suggested this is, quote, the single most important question in international affairs today. Actually, I can think of a related question that's more important. How likely is the United States to start a war? Beckley and Brands make the claim that democracies, such as the United States, are less likely to start wars, but actual research into this question suggests that this claim is very far from the truth. A study published recently in the Journal of Conflict Resolution found that the United States had conducted over 400 military interventions around the world since it was founded in the late 18th century. 25% of these were perpetrated in just the last 3 or 4 decades, or the most recent 12% of its history. So, not only is the US an exceptionally belligerent country, but it has only grown more warlike in recent years. In that time period, the US military openly intervened in Panama, Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Sudan, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, Libya, and Yemen, just to name the major examples. During the same time, China's military did not take part in any wars at all. Beckley and Brands have a much more confused way of guessing how war is likely to happen. They say that countries go to war because of their domestic problems, but they can't seem to decide which problems would motivate China to start war or how. For example, they point out that China is currently suffering high unemployment among young adults. But in the same paragraph, they also warn that China is about to lose 70 million workers as they grow older than the working age. So, which is it? Does China have a labor surplus or a labor shortage? And which one is supposed to make war more likely? The main problem with Beckley and Brand's reasoning is that they don't employ any logic in reaching their conclusion. Instead, they decided their conclusion that China is a threat ahead of time, before they started writing or even researching. If you've already decided that China is a threat, then anything you see China do or any problems you see China struggling with will turn into evidence of that in your eyes. What Beckley and Brands ended up doing didn't require any thought or analysis. They simply compiled a list of every negative thing that they'd heard about China lately. And they said that these all show that the war was coming, without realizing or caring that some of these things were contradictory. Now, let's not argue with facts in this case. China is going to face an aging crisis eventually. But Beckley and Brands can't explain how this will make war more likely. If your society has many more elders than young people, and you suffer a labor shortage as a result, a war will only make this problem worse. Many of your young people will die in the war, and while the rest are at war, they won't be able to raise families or work in the domestic economy. Your labor shortage will only get more acute. But even if we hypothetically agree that an aging crisis can cause war, will China really suffer from the worst such crisis in world history? One way to ease a labor shortage is to bring more workers into the cities. China still has a very large rural population. According to statistics tracked by the World Bank, about 500 million Chinese people still live in the countryside. But even China's closest neighbors in the Pacific region have a far smaller proportion of their population living in rural areas. For example, Japan is so urbanized that only 8% of the population is rural, compared with China's 36%. For Japan, the aging crisis isn't 10 years in the future, it's right now. In 2023, the proportion of the Chinese population older than 60 was just under 20%. In Japan, over 36% of the population is older than 60. But strangely, Beckley and Brands don't believe we should fear the possibility that Japan might start a war at all. Why not? Well, perhaps because Japan is occupied by about 50,000 US troops, and this is only a fraction of the US forces deployed in the Pacific. US military bases cover the entire region from South Korea to Papua New Guinea, and are currently expanding as the US pressures other countries under its influence to host more US forces and to buy more US weapons. There are now even US troops stationed on Kinmen Island, a mere 6 miles away from China's mainland coast. If a country like the United States, with such a history of unpredictable violence, was surrounding your home with its military, how could you interpret that as anything but an aggressive act? Incredibly, Beckley and Brands admit that the US and its allies are already engaging in open economic warfare against China by, quote, choking off its access to high-end semiconductors and slapping new trade and investment restrictions on Beijing every year. And they further recommend the formation of a, quote, global coalition of countries that can batter China's economy with sanctions and choke off its ocean-going trade. But wait, weren't they just telling us that domestic economic problems are supposed to make war more likely? If you didn't want to fight a war with China, and China's domestic problems would make that war more likely, then why would you actively try to make those problems worse? Also, why is the US trying to choke off China's access to high-end semiconductors in the first place? That sounds like a very hostile and aggressive act. Just look at the violent language they used: choking and battering. At the time that I recorded this, the United States military had been bombing 4 different countries in the Middle East and the surrounding area for the last several weeks. But the most aggressive thing the Chinese military has done lately, according to Beckley and Brands, was an incident last year where, in a standoff with boats from the Philippines, the Chinese Coast Guard opened fire with a water cannon. At a time when actual wars are raging all across the world and thousands of children are being killed every month by missiles and bombs made in the USA, Beckley and Brands are pretending that an incident involving a water cannon is somehow more concerning. It doesn't sound much like these men want to prevent a war. It sounds more like they want to start one.